the war in Cambodia, Cambodian pirates seized the SS Mayaguez, an American merchant ship. And in May 26, 1975, then President Gerald R. Ford, because recall that Richard Nixon resigned from the presidency in 1974, in 1975, President Ford dispatched a combined force of commandos, Marines, to seize this American merchant ship. Now, by May 1975, America had left Vietnam in defeat. And as this Time magazine cover shows, Ford draws the line. It was no secret before the world audience that the United States had been roundly and soundly defeated by the North Vietnamese. They won the conflict. But here we were, the dust had barely settled, the smoke had barely cleared, and here we were one more time with another crisis in Southeast Asia. The president and those warriors that went after the Mayaguez got that ship back. But what happened in the days, months, and years afterward was that we came to understand, we came to know an individual named Salazar. The world knew him more commonly as Pol Pot, the leader of the Khmer Rouge. The Khmer Rouge, a group of people who sought to take over the entire nation of Cambodia and eventually did. The Cambodians had been living with a monarch, but Pol Pot and his Khmer Rouge took over the nation. They drove all the people out of the cities to include the city, the capital, Phnom Penh. And what Pol Pot had in mind was not just taking over Cambodia and turning it into a communist paradise. He wanted to do something that was called taking the Cambodian people back to the year zero. Now, what that meant in his mind was something bizarre, to be sure. But one thing we were certain of, as he has his plan unfolded, it will be done through brute force. Pol Pot considered anyone who had any kind of education at all, people that wore glasses, people who were teachers, obviously anybody who worked at university, anybody who was a teacher, anybody who was an author, anybody who was a politician, he had them selected first and foremost for annihilation, not removal from power, but annihilation, mass murder. Anyone else who appeared to be educated, bankers, accountants, any civil engineers, anybody that had anything to do that could challenge his supremacy, his power in society, the Khmer Rouge was ordered to eliminate them. Very quickly, Cambodia fell into chaos, anarchy, and terror, sponsored by, driven by the Khmer Rouge, guided by Pol Pot. Young people who had lived oppressed lives, young people who were disillusioned with what had been going on, young people who had been living through warfare, young people who have been living in Southeast Asia, dominated by outside influences for many, many years, now led by this Cambodian leader, being fed a bunch of ideology, being shown, or at least having promised to them, a communist paradise. These young people, shaped by war, motivated by power. Now, there was, across the nation of Cambodia, a series of prisoner of war camps that were established. Let me share one with you about something that happened at a place called Camp 32. This gives you, we're not going to watch the whole thing, but this gives you an idea of the insanity of Pol Pot's dream for Cambodia and what he subjected his people to.
Now, Hom Chon was just 6 years old when he was imprisoned by the Khmer Rouge in a concentration camp known as Camp 32. It's estimated more than 30,000 people were killed at the hands of the pro-communist regime at this camp alone, including his father and his brother. Decades later, Hom Chon returning to Cambodia in a film named after the place he was imprisoned.
No, it's really peaceful if you look at Sarajevo. For something so peaceful like this, how can a horrible event take place just like that. I am going back to the past, but I'm going back to the past in search of my own future.
Anyone that goes to Camp 32 that went there, not a lot survive, not a lot come out.
All the family in Cambodia, 90% of us, had at least one member die during the KR.
And earlier today, I spoke to Hom Chon about his film.
The film is about Camp 32. Right now, it's not documented. There are many undocumented camps in Cambodia. And I made this film with 3 other people. There's Gay Miller, there's Andrew, and there's Tim Purdy.
As you say, this is a camp in which you were held prisoner along with your family as well, and it is undocumented. Is that an unusual situation for a camp in the Khmer Rouge regime to be completely secret?
It's not unusual. What is unusual about this camp is that if we can prove its existence, which we have proven, we just need more evidence, is that it would be the largest killing camp in Cambodia because all the other camps are smaller in numbers.
We should take note of several facts pointed out in this very brief video clip. The first was that the Cambodian government sought to hide the extent, or not the Cambodian government so much, but the Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot sought to hide the extent of the atrocities they were committing. This brings to mind something that the Nazis were doing at the end of World War II. As defeat was looking more and more certain, they tried to move prisoners from concentration camps to areas where they wouldn't be discovered at all, or at least not discovered so soon. Which suggests then that even bloodthirsty killers are aware of the fact that should the extent and level of their atrocities be found out, there will be a heavy accountability to be experienced. Pol Pot knew that. And also the fact that the gentleman, the narrator in the film, he was held in that camp at the age of 6. What kind of person, what kind of regime takes 6-year-old children or any child or any human being at any age and subjects them to those kind of horrors? And today in the 21st century, the victims who are lost during the Cambodian killing fields, at different sites around the country, when people visit, all that's left of them to speak of what happened to them are these pictures. We at least have their faces, to remember their images, was testify, was give proof to the fact that once upon a time, they were here. That once upon a time, they were leading lives, had dreams and destinies, but all of it came to a very quick end under the insanity and brutality of Pol Pot. In 1984, with the Vietnam War getting further and further in America's rearview mirror, Hollywood made a film entitled The Killing Fields, which looked at, well, the Cambodian genocide. It starred Sam Waterston playing a newspaper reporter who was in the country at the time when Pol Pot was driving people into the countryside, trying to reestablish the year zero or establish the year zero. And his coach, Sam Waterston, is playing a reporter who's there looking at the situation as people are fleeing the Khmer Rouge, trying to get to safety, trying to get to freedom. And he has a Cambodian assistant who is eventually captured by the Khmer Rouge and ends up in one of these camps. The man to Sam Waterston's right, the Cambodian gentleman to Sam Waterston's right, is a man named Dr. Hang Sing Nor, who actually did, he's an actor, but he actually did spend time in a Cambodian Khmer Rouge prisoner of war camp. I don't exactly think that calling him a prisoner of war is the right term. So let me just say this. He was a prisoner, not necessarily a war, because the Khmer Rouge, they weren't fighting according to the common rules of war, such as they are recognized by the Geneva Convention. These are just bloodthirsty killers. And in the movie, Dr. Noor puts on a very convincing performance. How could he not? He had been actually a prisoner in a Khmer camp. And as I recall, he won an Academy Award for his performance. These are some of the scenes from the killing fields. In this one, he's escaping. And as he escapes, he suddenly finds himself in an open ditch, a burial ground where bodies have decomposed. Now, the amazing thing about Dr. Han Sing-Nor is that here's a guy who lived through the Vietnam War. He lived through the expansion of the war from Vietnam into Cambodia. He lived through seeing his country lose its monarchy. He lived through seeing Pol Pot take over the government. He lived through seeing Pol Pot enter the cities out into the countryside and returning the country back to this crazy idea of the year zero. He found his way to the United States. He found his way into the cast of The Killing Fields. He won an Oscar for his performance. And the tragic irony of Dr. Han Sing-Nor is that having made it to America, having starred in this film, having reached the kind of heights that any actor in Hollywood would like to attain, winning an Oscar, he lost his life to an act of crime inside the United States.
Would physician, humanitarian, and Oscar winner Dr. Hang Nor is remembered 20 years after his murder here in LA.
And paying tribute to Hang Nor is his friend and KTLA's Kimberly Chang. She joins us now here in studio with her special report. Kimberly?
Sure, Micah. This story near and dear to me. I knew Hang Nor growing up. My parents are also genocide survivors, and he was a close family friend.
I love him like my brother, and I do anything for him.
A refugee who faced and endured atrocities for years, yet with no acting experience, he became a Hollywood star seemingly overnight.
The winner is Hang S. Nor.
This is Dr. Hang S. Nor, the first Asian male to win an Oscar for Best Supporting Actor for 1984's The Killing Fields, where life truly imitated art.
If the war keeps going like this, the future could be very bad.
A role so raw and real, the physician turned actor could only watch it once.
We're so proud of him, but I was a little bit envious of him too. He was so famous.
In reality, Nor survived the Cambodian killing fields. He was a doctor before the Khmer Rouge forced him and millions of others into labor camps where he was tortured and watched his wife die in his arms. After 4 years, the Khmer Rouge fell and Nor fled to the US as a refugee. He became a social worker in Chinatown and was discovered by a casting director at a wedding. He became well known, not just for his acting, but for his outspoken voice.
They were killing doctors and professional people. Any kind, or you educate people, or you anybody educated. Yeah, let's kill you.
He took that Oscar almost like a weapon and said, okay, people want to see this Oscar, but you also will get to hear what I have to say about what's going on in Cambodia.
Arthur Dong, a filmmaker and professor at Loyola Marymount University, documented Dr. Nor's life in The Killing Fields of Dr. Hang S. Nor.
He traveled the whole world just speaking out because no one was at that time. He was a real pioneer in getting the word out and advocating for justice in Cambodia.
But this story does not have a Hollywood or happy ending. In February 1996, Dr. Nor's life cut short, shot and killed outside his modest apartment in Chinatown.
Police were investigating the murder of Hang Nor.
Police call it a robbery gone wrong. 3 gang members convicted. Still today, a theory among the Cambodian community. It was an assassination.
The notion of revenge is often brought up. The notion of an assassination that was planned by Pol Pot.
In Long Beach, where there's a large
I don't know about you all, but every time I watch that video clip, I just am overwhelmed with the irony. Here's a guy who lived through what can only be described as one of the most hellish experiences for a human being. He makes it to the United States and has his life taken by a robbery. American policy didn't stop there. The United States, after Vietnam, after the killing fields, had to find a way of reorganizing itself, of reassessing its military. You recall that last week we mentioned that a good part of the military during the Vietnam War was a drafty army. The Pentagon began an immediate study after Vietnam and looking at that with all of the challenges that have been encountered with a drafty army. Eventually, the decision was made to go to what they call an AVF, all volunteer force. And all volunteer force is what we have right now. At Hope College, every now and then I ask my students in the US military class, are they still required to sign up or register with the Selective Service in case of a draft? Yes, they are. So we still have a system that is in place so that should there be a need for a draft, one can be implemented. But right now, ever since the end of the Vietnam War, we have had a superb fighting force that has been structured with or filled with the ranks filled by women and men of our all volunteer force. In 1976, as Pol Pot is beginning to influence and impose his madness upon the Cambodian people, in 1976, Jimmy Carter ran for president and won. Now, Jimmy Carter, during the time that he was in office, many people consider him to be a weak foreign policy president, or at least a foreign policy president who was very controversial in some of his decisions. Either way, he won the presidency, and as the president, he became the point person for setting the agenda and the priorities for American foreign policy. And American foreign policy needed some significant repair after Vietnam. To say that people were lost, confused, unsure, unclear, perplexed, disoriented, bewildered. What was America's role in the world right now? America is still a very prominent and significant member of NATO. What was America's role in Europe? What was America's role as the leader of the free world in a world that was still very much threatened by the Soviet Union, and a world still very much living under the possibility of the shadow of a nuclear confrontation? Nowhere near like what John Kennedy had confronted in 1962 during the October missile crisis, but nuclear weapons were still a problem. They remain a problem. So the 39th president got to work and set his priorities. And his priorities happened to focus on an area of the world known as the Middle East, and particularly something called the Arab-Israeli conflict. From September 6 through 1978, James Earl Carter invited the leader of Israel, Menachem Begin, and the leader of Egypt, Anwar el-Sadat, to Camp David. Now, these two guys were about as different and as far apart on issues of agreement, likely agreement, anything having to do with their two countries as you could find for any two leaders in all of history. Anwar Sadat had been in Egypt and had been around during the time at the end of World War II when people in what became Israel started fighting for their independence in 1948. Menachem Begin had been a cell leader in 1948 and eventually will rise to the ranks to become, as I mentioned, the Prime Minister of Israel. Both of these guys were soldiers. Both of these guys understood the rules of the battlefield. Both of these guys were very strong-willed. Both of these guys were exceedingly determined and understood or convinced that the success of the other meant the end of their people, the end of their nation. And neither one had been prepared up until this point to agree to any kind of peace. Egypt at the time was seen as being the leader of the Arab world, not so much Saudi Arabia, Egypt. And then, and what many people considered to be a miracle, Jimmy Carter got Anwar al-Sadat and Menachem Begin to come to Camp David and to sit down for many days and talk over their differences. Scholars of the Silver-sized submarine audience, I would try to add some words to this, but the words speak for themselves. And before it was over with, an agreement known as the Camp David Accords. Look at the celebration between these two men. That appears to be genuine laughter on Anwar al-Sadat's face. Clearly, President Carter, always known for his very toothy smile, he's happy, and so is Menachem Begin. These two avowed enemies agreed to peace between Israel and Egypt. Bear with me as I read very quickly some of the major highlights of what became the Camp David Accords. There would be a formal peace treaty to be signed between Israel and Egypt within 3 months. A peace treaty, not a ceasefire, a peace treaty. They would establish diplomatic relations. Do you understand that the relationship between Israel and Egypt was so poisoned they didn't even have the diplomatic means to talk to each other? Israel agreed to withdraw from the Sinai Peninsula in stages to be completed within 3 years. And you see from this map, the Sinai Peninsula is a very big piece of territory to Egypt, to the west. They agreed that further meetings would be held to resolve the issue of the Palestinian question, the issue which remains with us today. And they would include Jordan. Jordan, generally seen as being one of the more moderate Arab states in the region, that Jordan would be the representative of the Palestinians. Because recall at the time, I'm sure a number of you probably remember a guy named Yasser Arafat, who was the recognized leader of many Palestinians. Another agreement was that there would be a 5-year transitional period of Israeli withdrawal from the West Bank and Gaza. You know that today, the West Bank, the Sinai Peninsula, and Gaza remain sticky points. They remain points of controversy between the Israelis and the Palestinians to this day. It seems that we've made so much progress on these Camp David Accords, and then poof. In so many ways, we've gone backwards. And then finally, the big question that remains with us today, the Israelis agreed that they will put an end to Israeli settlements and into the expansion of Israeli settlements on the West Bank. And the question of East Jerusalem will remain unsettled. Another big issue for President Carter was oil.
They're part of the peanut
air and space. Okay.
Now,
and
at the time, the United States had already gone through one major oil crisis in 1973 as a result of a conflict between the Arabs and the Israelis. And in 1976, the economy was still reeling from trying to adjust to the post-Vietnam era. But what was becoming more and more prominent, what was becoming more and more of an issue, was America's increasing dependence upon Middle Eastern oil. Enter Mohammad Mossadegh. A major supplier of oil to the United States in this period was the nation of Iran. Now, Mohammad Mossadegh had been the democratically elected prime minister of Iran, who was in power from 1951 to 1953. We need to remember the time, the context of the larger period in the early 1950s. It's the beginning of the Cold War. The Soviet Union and the United States are looking to extend their influence to different parts around the world. Iran is very close to the Soviet Union, or at least close to some Soviet republics. Mohammad Mossadegh came to power in 1951. America's involved in the Korean War. So the whole idea of the domino theory is very much alive and well at the front of American policymakers. And they're looking in Central Asia, they're looking in Asia, they're looking in Africa, they're looking around the world to see where the next domino is going to fall. Mohammad Mossadegh was what they called a nationalist. We need to understand that part of what drove Mohammad Mossadegh was that with Iran having been colonized or had significant British influence, the one thing that Mohammad Mossadegh wanted was foreign influence out of his country. He was aware that Iran had a lot of oil wealth, and he wanted the Iranian people to experience that wealth for themselves. So he had to be removed. So a plot was engineered by the Central Intelligence Agency, and Mohammad Mossadegh, the elected prime minister of Iran, was removed from office, and in his place, the person named Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the Shah of Iran, began his rule. Now, the Shah was what they called an autocrat. The Shah had a secret police force called the Savak, S-A-V-A-K, the Savak. Just like the Russians had their KGB, just like the Nazis had their Gestapo, the Shah had the Savak. The Savak that was used to disappear people at night. The Savak that was used to torture people. The Savak that was used to spy on people. The Savak that was used to spy on Iranian citizens. And the Shah was a very popular leader with people in the West. And as you can see, the Shah got around through several administrations. The Shah here with President Dwight D. Eisenhower. So Dwight Eisenhower elected president from 1952 to 1956 and from 1956 to 1960. And then here's the Shah with President John F. Kennedy. Kennedy elected in 1960, and of course, he's assassinated on November 22nd, 1963. And then after Kennedy, you are well aware of the fact that after Kennedy, his vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, assumed the presidency. Here's the Shah with President Johnson. And then after Johnson was defeated or chose not to run in 1968, the winner of that election in 1968 was Richard Nixon. Nixon, of course, will have to resign from office and will leave in 1974, and Gerald Ford becomes president. Here's the Shah with President Ford. Look, the message that we get here is that the Shah was a friend of the United States. He was a friend to the West, or let's put it like this, he could be friendly to the West. And he depended upon the West to stay in power, and the West depended upon the Shah, America in particular, for its oil resources, but also because of the location, the proximity of Iran to the Soviet Union as an intelligence gathering location. So there were mutual benefits for having Iran as an ally. But while all this is going on, while America is gaining some benefit foreign policy-wise and geostrategically from having Iran as an ally, and this is what I mean about from here to Tehran to Kabul, Tehran in Iran, Kabul in Afghanistan. After President Ford leaves office, you see that while the Shah was also very friendly to the West, here he is shaking hands with the Soviet leader, Leonid Brezhnev. Now, after Joseph Stalin died in 1953, there was a power struggle in the Soviet Union, as there would be in any kind of totalitarian state. People were jockeying for power, and the winner of that struggle was a man named Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev. Khrushchev was the one who pounded his shoe on the podium at the UN, talking about he would annihilate the United States. After Khrushchev was humiliated and removed from power after the 1962 October missile crisis, Leonid Brezhnev rose to power, and Leonid Brezhnev will be in charge of the Soviet Union. He will be the general secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union for many, many, many years. Here's the Shah with Jimmy Carter. Here's the Shah with Carter, and eventually something happened in 1979. Now, Jimmy Carter was elected in 1976. There's a presidential election in 1980. But in 1979, the Shah of Iran needed some medical attention. And there were already anti-Shah demonstrations in Iran. Track with me very closely. In 1979, I was an undergraduate in college. I had a friend of mine named Mohammed Hadri. Mohammed was from Iran. And when the anti-Shah protest started in Iran, I remember coming to class one day where Mohammed said to me, he said, "Johnson, I must go back to my country." I said, "Hadri, are you going to leave in the middle of the semester?" He said, "You don't understand. People want freedom. The same way that Americans had their revolution, people in Iran want freedom. I'm going to go back and protest with my brothers and sisters, and we can get rid of the Shah." And I didn't know exactly as much as I needed to know back then about what the Shah had been doing, but I saw the intense look on Hadri's face. He was so determined to go back there and join what we now know of as the Iranian Revolution. The Shah had to leave the country and get some medical attention. He did and came to the United States. When President Carter allowed him to come into the United States, that's when everything flew apart. But let me not leave this part out. You see on the left panel, the person Ayatollah Khomeini. Now, one of the things that the Shah had done while he was in power was that he had suppressed all religious expression or tried to suppress it. Now, you all know, there's anything you know about human beings, the moment you tell them they can't do something, that's exactly what they're going to want to do. And for people of the Islamic faith who are determined to worship Muhammad, who are determined to go to their mosque, to tell them that they couldn't worship, the Shah was able to do it through terror. And what happened was that the Ayatollah Khomeini had been driven from the country, and at the time, in 1979, he was living in France. So as the social situation in Iran became more and more unstable, as more and more people became emboldened and wanted to seize power from the Shah, in 1979, Ayatollah Khomeini, who was in his late 70s, early 80s at the time, he returned to Iran and became a force of nature. You see this picture right here, January 17, 1979, the anti-Shah forces. Clearly the Shah was losing control of the situation in Iran. And in February 1979, Ayatollah Khomeini came back to Iran. Hold on one second, let me show you this.
Ayatollah Khomeini returned to Iran on February 1st, 1979. Several million people showed up to greet him. His arrival was a turning point in the Iranian Revolution.
We could hear the sound of the helicopter. Apparently the crowds were so big that they could not drive Khomeini to the airport, so they were flying him on a military plane, which seemed quite odd given the military's opposition to his return. And as the helicopter appeared in view, it flew in sort of an arc pattern, I think so the Ayatollah could see the crowds. This huge cheer arose from the crowd, and people were chanting slogans. Security was trying to make sure nobody surged forward onto the landing pad.
They clawed and clambered and ran to see and be near him.
The Ayatollah's helicopter landed and he got out.
Khomeini announced that he wouldn't recognize the government left by the Shah. He also blamed the United States for Iran's problems. Final victory for Iran, he noted, wouldn't come until all foreigners were expelled.
When he left, the crowd again went wild. They surged forward, and I remember seeing people were jumping up, trying to grab hold of the helicopter blades as if to climb into the helicopter with him.
Khomeini's words were a sign of things to come. Reed recalls one particularly hairy day that February. Protesters tossed Molotov cocktails made out of Coke bottles at a tank, which caught fire. He needed to send his editors his story, but a late afternoon curfew was imposed. Suddenly, a telling moment of the revolution presented itself.
The implication being this was a 4 o'clock shoot to kill curfew, and by this time we were fairly shaken. So we tried to flag down a car because we'd let our taxi go, but nobody wanted to pick us up because of me. I was an American. Finally, the translator convinced some guy that I was a German. He let us in the car and we tried to drive out. but it was hard to drive out because people started building these barricades to protect the base and keep the Imperial Guard from coming back. And I remember an older, I would say elderly man and his wife. The man was dressed in a coat and tie. His wife had a fur coat on, and they were both trying to pull down a stop sign to build a barricade. And we had always had the idea that this was basically a lower middle class revolution. But seeing these people on the street, I thought to myself, if the Shah's lost these people, he's lost everybody.
Just as the speaker said, the Shah had lost everybody. And I want to go back and revisit something that the narrator said, that when Khomeini came in, he said that the victory would not be complete until all foreigners had left the country. So Iranians, like my friend Mohammed Hadri, inside the United States and around the world, were returning to Iran, and foreigners were being asked or directed to get out of Iran. And if you'll note that when Ayatollah Khomeini said that all foreigners, he wanted to leave the country, in other words, he wanted to nationalize or do something close to nationalization, it was very close to the same kind of idea that Mohammad Mossadegh had back in the early 1950s for Iranian independence and the removal of foreign influence. Then on November 4th, 1979, so Khomeini comes back in February 79, and on November 4th, 1979, something which at the time we thought was unthinkable happened. Iranian students climbed over the walls of the US Embassy. In effect, in diplomatic language, nations around the world for hundreds of years have understood that outside of their embassy walls, it is the host country, but inside those walls, that was American territory. They essentially climbed over those walls, invaded American territory. The Marine Guard on station at the embassy very quickly realized that to engage in a firefight would be suicide. They set aside their arms. And when people saw the pictures later on of these Iranian students climbing over the walls of the American embassy, for many people, it reminded them of the Vietnamese who had been trying to climb over the walls of the American embassy during those hectic, chaotic days during the evacuation of Vietnam, as shown here. It was a very ignominious retreat from Vietnam, a very, very humiliating retreat from the embassy in Vietnam. And it seemed like history was repeating itself all over again in a different kind of way, just in a different country. They took the American flag. They burned it. They took American hostages. And those of you who remember this, you'll remember that it wasn't soon after that the newsman Ted Koppel essentially made a name or became very famous as a result of this, because there was a news show called Nightline that began coming on every night. And Ted Koppel would say, Nightline, day number 12 of the Iranian hostage crisis. Nightline, day number 39. Nightline, day number 52. Day number 116. Day number 266. It went on and on and on every night. And I must tell you that I tried my best every night to be there watching that Nightline to see if I could even get a glimpse of my friend Hadri Muhammad. At the time, I was in OCS, Officer Candidate School, about to join the Marine Corps and get commissioned. And we were being told by commanding officers and others who pretty much were supposed to know that if there was going to be an enemy to fight, it was going to be there. That was the next front line of America's conflict. Here we see our hostages, American hostages taken in Iran. And for every day that the American hostages were held, President Carter, it appeared, I emphasize it appeared, because we now know he wasn't just sitting on his hands. It appeared that nothing was happening. American hostages. This is probably one of the most famous pictures to come out of that period, showing the American hostages who were taken out blindfolded, The whole idea was to humiliate the West, and particularly to humiliate the United States. These Iranian students and the Iranian people began, at least the leaders of the revolution, they began referring to America as the Great Satan. And the poisonous relationship that we have with Iran to this day, so much of it started right during this period. There were hostilities beforehand. But the difficulties that we have today, if we are to have any hope of resolving our differences with Iran, we got to go back to this period and interrogate what happened here, its causes, but also what happened during and immediately afterward. So the hostage crisis began to extend into a year. And as has often been the case, the cover of Time and/or Newsweek captured the essence of the moment in their cover stories. You can see the Shah at his royal prominence, and then the Shah in trouble, and then the Shah in exile, then the Shah in power, and then, as this Time magazine cover shows on the right, November 25th, 1979, the test of wills. And scholars of the Silver Size Museum, it is no accident that Ayatollah Khomeini's face is superimposed over or contains the inset of Jimmy Carter's face, because at that point, the Ayatollah Khomeini was looming so large in Iran and on the world stage. And people who had gone back to Iran to stage the revolution, there were many other Iranians who left. When I first started working at Hope College in the early 2000s, there was a woman named Susan Arafat Peckham, who was on the faculty at Hope College. Her family fled Iran during the same period that I'm talking about. Sadly, Susan was killed in a car accident, but she was just one of many people, one of many families who did not want to live under a theocracy or a tyranny hiding itself in religious robes. And then in 1979, as some of you are aware, Time does not necessarily say that a person that becomes man or woman of the year has to be somebody that we like, just the individual who's had the most impact, has been most influential that year. And they decided in 1979, it was Ayatollah Khomeini. Then, just when you thought that 1979 couldn't be more horrible, think of how many times we had thought about this. Remember 1968? April 4th, Martin Luther King Jr. getting shot down in Memphis. Then several months later, Bobby Kennedy being assassinated in Los Angeles. And then that summer of 1968, the chaos of the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. And people were wondering, when will this year end? Then there's 1979, the hostage crisis. Ayatollah Khomeini coming back to Iran. Then just when you thought you had seen all that you had seen, on December 25th, 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. At the time, there was a communist government, or at least a client state of the Soviet Union, a government inside Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan, supported by the Russians. It was losing power. It was under threat. So the Russians, just as they had done in Hungary in 1956, just as they did in Czechoslovakia in 1968, just as they would do in 1979, the Russians, whenever one of their client states was in trouble, the Russians sent in tanks and troops and aircraft. As you can see from this map, Soviet transports, they came by land, they came by air. And they came to prop up the government in Kabul. The Russians and their invasion were not to be taken lightly, because among other things, they had this particular piece of equipment called the MIL H-24 Hind helicopter. People who were in the military at the time referred to the Hind helicopter as a flying tank. It had the ability to carry a good number of troops. It had significant firepower in the forward guns, plus it had missiles on both of those wings. This was a very powerful, powerful, powerful helicopter. You can see even on the ground how menacing it was. Yes, this was the helicopter that, among other pieces of equipment, the Russians used to help spearhead their invasion of Afghanistan. So they came in their BMPs, their armored personnel carriers. They came by the thousands, and before long, the Russians found themselves bogged down in Afghanistan, and people on this side of the Atlantic, people inside the United States began calling it the Russian Vietnam, which we should not go past that very quickly. When people refer to Afghanistan as the Russian Vietnam, there is so much insight in that. What this meant was Americans were already now 5 years, 6 years, or 4 or 5 years after Vietnam. After we're out of Vietnam, Americans are beginning to use Vietnam as a metaphor. And what is that metaphor? A place where you go to supposedly work out your interests and then get bogged down. It becomes a place that swallows you up. You go there to exercise initiative, but by the time it's all over with, it's exercise initiative on you. And then the cost, you lose an ability to get out, then the cost of getting out is more expensive than getting in. But at the same time, you can't stay there. To borrow Thomas Jefferson's phrase in talking about the relationship that America had with slavery, it would be like having a wolf by the ears. You can neither hold it nor safely let it go. And before long, and it didn't take long at all, before the Russians find themselves involved in a civil war, fighting a group of people called the Mujahideen. On this side of the Atlantic, in the United States, the Mujahideen were called freedom fighters. And of course, what would we have called them? The Russians had invaded Afghanistan. Indigenous Afghans were fighting to liberate their country of Soviet communist influence. So what the United States started doing was funneling Stinger, shoulder-launched, surface-to-air missiles, heat-seeking missiles, which proved to be so effective against those deadly Hind helicopters. As American Stinger missiles began shooting those helicopters out of the sky, as the Mujahideen became more potent, more organized, and trained by American operatives, the tide slowly turned on the war in Afghanistan. But it didn't mean that the war was being won. It just meant that the tide was being slowly turned. This political cartoon sums up the feeling at the time. There's a Soviet bear telling Afghanistan, hush, little baby, you'll wake up the neighbors. The Afghan opposition for the Afghan Op 4 is a military phrase for opposition forces. The opposition forces look like this. The Afghan soldiers, the people that fought against the Russians in Afghanistan, the people that have fought against the Americans in Afghanistan, these are people in areas of Afghanistan, Waziristan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, all of that area of that part of the world of Central Asia that diplomats refer to as the stands. These people have been at war for centuries. They were not conquered by Alexander the Great. They were not conquered by the British. They were not conquered by the Russians. And we have yet to bring them into alignment with our wishes and desires as well. The Afghan people seem to have been at war forever. If there's one thing they do war, but they also want peace. This was the opposition force. This was the force that the Russians were going up against, who by all appearances, given their lack of supplies, their scattered numbers, their poor supply routes, they should have been easily beaten. But just like the Americans found out in Vietnam, it is the exact kind of force like that, that given the will to win and their desire to hold on for as long as possible, they can very often beat a superior, numerically superior, more well-supplied force. And this is a picture of one of those Afghan warriors holding a Stinger surface-to-air shoulder-launched missile. That front sign says it all. Afghanistan is Vietnam of the Soviet Union, of the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic. Time carried a story that says Moscow's bold challenge. Could Moscow do in Afghanistan? Could it be a different result than America had achieved in Vietnam? And it was in that period where Afghanistan was destabilized, where eventually the destabilization of Afghanistan and the eventual withdrawal of Russian troops, and when the Mujahideen that have been fighting more or less organized, not completely together, but more or less at least toward the same objective, that is getting the Russians out of Afghanistan. Once the Russians were gone, the Mujahideen turned their wrath on each other, and a civil war ensued. And in the midst of that civil war, someone came to their country named Osama bin Laden, who had his own agenda, his own ideas, and his own hopes and dreams for how he thinks the world should have been operating. And he had in mind the desire to get even, to get revenge for a nation that he had identified as a source of so much of his family's problems. He took advantage of the instability in Afghanistan, and it would require yet another group of American men and women, soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and Coast Guards women and men, who would once have to step forward to the front line of duty when this individual, Osama bin Laden, unleashed his fury upon the United States. That wouldn't take place for a number of years, but the Soviet invasion gave him the opening that he needed. The subsequent civil war, and we will pick up on talking about events after that next week. I will now take your questions.
Thank you, Fred. While everyone is getting around to unmuting to ask their questions, I have 3 questions for you that came in through the chat at the bottom of your page.
The question is, was there a direct connection between the Khmer Rouge and the Mayaguez pirates? I do not know. I'll check.
Okay. The second one, unfortunately, I phrased as a statement, but please answer it.
No, women are not registered for selective service. I have not talked to any of my female students who said they registered. Every male student has said that they have to register. Please discuss the guards. Who guards the American embassy? Generally speaking, there's a Marine detachment that's assigned to guard all embassies around the world. Just like there's usually a Marine detachment that is aboard many naval vessels in the U.S. Navy. The Marines are, after all, a part of the Department of the Navy.
And can you explain then how, when the embassies were taken over in Vietnam and in Iran, were the Marine Guards a part of this saving and attempting to maintain these the embassies at that point?
Yes, in Vietnam, the embassy guards were U.S. Marines, and in Tehran, the embassy guards were U.S. Marines. And as I mentioned, it became very quickly, the numbers of people coming over those fences and the urgency of the moment, the crisis, the extraordinary circumstances told the embassy guards at the embassy in Tehran that if they had engaged in a firefight, it would have been a bloodbath. So they let the students have their way. This is not to say they didn't do anything to try and protect the people that they were in charge of protecting. Now in Vietnam, given the fact that it was an evacuation situation, the embassy guards, I showed you all that one picture of a serviceman who's standing atop an embassy gate, and they were controlling the number of people that are climbing over the gate to get inside the embassy compound. It was, again, another exceedingly chaotic situation in Vietnam. And how do you, as a lone, Marine Corps, Lance Corporal, or Staff Sergeant, figure out who to let in and who not to let in? But in either case, in both Saigon and in Tehran, embassy guards, U.S. Marines, were guarding the embassy.
Hey, do you have any other questions? There was another question brought up about two different movies that were made recently about these times, and one of them is Argo, and one of them is Charlie Wilson's War.
Right.
Do you think that it's worthwhile for people to watch those films? Do they feel
Absolutely. And there's okay, so Argo, I don't want to be a spoiler here, but let's just say that Argo deals with the very complex operation that took place to bring those American hostages out of Iran. I'll just leave it like that. And as far as Charlie Wilson's War goes, Charlie Wilson was, at least the way Tom Hanks is depicted in the movie playing Charlie Wilson was a minor player congressman in Congress from Texas. Charlie Wilson, as shown in the film, is a guy that likes to have a good time. He likes to have pretty women around him, and he begins to make deals. He is an associate of a very powerful woman in Texas who is got some real strong ideas about communism. She wants to defeat the Russians in Afghanistan. And so she basically enlists him. Now, this is the movie, enlists him to start funneling the Stinger missiles to the Afghan Mujahideen to blow those helicopters out of the sky. There's one line in that movie that I tell you, I laughed my head off when I heard it. And it's the scene where Julia Roberts, who's playing the very successful woman, she says, "Charlie, can you please explain to me why Congress is doing a lot of talking and doing nothing?" And he says, "Mostly tradition." And I said, okay, that must have been the writers taking a little bit of, humorous liberty. But I would just say, yes, that one is also very much worth seeing. Charlie Wilson's War and Argo.
Okay. Do we have any other questions from the group? We had a very large group here this evening. Anyone else have any questions that you would like to have answered, or discussion points that you would like to bring up? Well, I guess not. Well, thank you everyone for another wonderful lecture, and for coming and for participating with us at the USS Silverside Submarine Museum. One of the biggest things, as I say before, and I talk an awful lot about our mission, and our mission is to honor veterans. And in order for us to properly honor our veterans, we have to be understanding of what they've been involved in. And this series particularly gives us a chance to see a period when there was no major conflicts going on, a lot of minor conflicts going on, and a lot of things building up to it. But yet our military is always very engaged in all of these different things at the front lines. And oftentimes people don't realize the harm's way we put them in and the situations that they need to deal with on a daily basis. And so it is in that we honor so many of our veterans by understanding their service that they have given. And I would like to thank anyone that served any point in the American military, because we never know what the federal government or government is going to ask of you. And we appreciate everything that you have done. Next week, we have another enthralling lecture. If you have the link for this lecture, it'll be the same for next week. You don't have to email Teresa back to get another link. And we hope that you continue to bring friends and other people that are interested in this, because the more people that we can have discussing these things, the more we can honor those that actually served during this time. If any of you are in the area and you're interested, the museum is open daily, 7 days a week. We practice all COVID restrictions and social distancing, and we'd be happy to have you come out and visit us at any point. Or if you're looking for something to do once the world comes back and opens up again, we would love to have you come out and volunteer with us. We have a lot of wonderful volunteer activities at the museum. And just please use that same email, and we'll respond to you back with a host of wonderful things that we have to do at the museum. Thank you all for coming back with us this evening, and I look forward to seeing you all again next week. Thank you very much. Good night.
Thanks, Fred.
You're welcome.
Congratulations. Thank you.
Fred, can you hang on 2 seconds?
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you all next week.
Yes, just hang on for it. Well, okay. Tell Fred to come back. Thank you.
He has to go. Bye.